Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we focus our attention on benchmark CG 3.6, in which we analyze how the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments broaden participation in the political process. In Part 2, we evaluate the impact of these 6 amendments on American society, including participation in the political process. Benchmark Clarification 2 focuses on evaluating the impact of these amendments, while Benchmark Clarification 3 focuses on examining how these amendments increased participation in the political process. We ask these questions. How have these 6 amendments impacted American society, and how have these 6 amendments impacted political participation? Let's now look at a statement from the American Civil Liberties Union. The American Civil Liberties Union focuses on how did the 14th Amendment affect American society. And in this particular excerpt, we are focusing on both civil rights and civil liberties. When we're focusing on civil rights, we're focusing on the rights of citizenship, that the 14th Amendment defines U.S. citizenship. But what the 14th Amendment also does is it denies to states the opportunity to discriminate against people living in those states, thus whether citizens or not, as to extending them their due process and their equal protection. And so we see that when we're focusing on the Supreme Court and the 14th Amendment, that we're looking at the 14th Amendment in terms of both the rights of citizenship, that's national, as well as the protections from states discriminating against someone, denying them both their equal protection and their due process. So the 14th Amendment has a lot of interesting components that all affected the impact of the 13th, 14th, 15th, etc. other amendments, because the 14th focuses on citizenship, due process, and equal protection. Let's read together. For 150 years, the Supreme Court applied the 14th Amendment in rulings that have shaped civil rights and liberties in America. Introduced to address the racial discrimination endured by Black people who were recently emancipated, that would be the 13th Amendment, which emancipated Black people from slavery. The 14th Amendment confirmed the rights and privileges of citizenship and for the first time guaranteed all Americans equal protection under the law. It's the states that are responsible for guaranteeing equal protection. Consequently, the 14th Amendment continues to be central to the fight for racial equality and many other social justice movements. Much work remains to ensure that these protections are inclusive. So we see that the 14th Amendment, because it includes both federal protections of citizenship and state mandates relating to not denying either due process or equal protection to all persons, that it is a very wide-ranging and impactful amendment. Now we're going to be looking at a political cartoon that is, the artist is Herbert Block. He goes by Her Block. His political cartoons are widely available and very much interesting. So let's look at the symbols in this political cartoon, and thus we're talking about the impact of the 15th Amendment on political participation. So here we have the 15th Amendment that was ratified in 1870, saying states cannot deny anyone the right to vote based on their race. And yet, here we see someone who, on the right side, he has darker skin. He also went to this Tuskegee Institute, which is an all-black institute. It was at the time. He's college educated. He's carrying a briefcase, so he went to this college. He is presenting himself, wanting to vote, and we can see the lock, the padlock, on the ballot box. And someone is also using their feet to cover the slot so that this person cannot cast a ballot. We also see that there are 3 people against 1 person. And thus, we see that even though the 15th Amendment was in place at the time that this cartoon was written, and it was written in the late 1950s, so, almost 100 years later, about 90 years later, that here's someone who can't spell saying, you ain't got, right? Can't spell, can't speak well, you ain't got enough education to vote. So what Herbert Bloch is communicating is that 90 years after the 15th Amendment guaranteed all persons, regardless of their race, the right to vote. Mind you, persons who were female could be denied the right to vote until later on, but all men who would otherwise have the right to vote except for their race, we see that the state governments were making decisions as to how much education a person had to have, even if they themselves were uneducated. And the reason that I'm focusing on the states is because the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, does give to states the power to manage elections. And so among those rules that states can do is to decide what the requirements are to be registered to vote, and one of these might be education. So even an uneducated person who doesn't speak well, having state power, could then deny an educated black man the right to vote. What about women's participation? Right? States were denied the right to deny women the right to vote as of 1920. And what we see here is that since 1920, looking at this graph, since 1920, the number of women in Congress has increased tremendously. So what this tells us is, in terms of impact on society, that once women got the right to vote, they also had the right to run for public office, specifically running for Congress. And once women had the right to run for Congress, more and more of them were elected to Congress, which means that women then had the power to write and to shape and to debate public policy as lawmakers. And so here we see an impact not just on participation, where more women are running for Congress, but we also see the impact on society because more women are serving in Congress, which means that there are more women making laws. There are more women who are participating in other elements of congressional power. So that's really very important. So let's look at these bars more closely. And here we see that over time, there has been far more women who were securing seats in the U.S. House of Representatives as Democrats compared to Republicans. The Democrats are the blue bars that we see, and the Republicans are the red bars. We've seen that both for Republicans and Democrats, there's been a significant increase since the 1930s, 40s, and 50s as to the number of women who are seeking and securing seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, one of the reasons why we see this significant change is there has been a significant increase in the number of women running for these seats. And as more women win seats, they are then in a position to help other women who might be seeking to run for office in other districts. So an endorsement, for example, from a member of Congress is going to help other people decide, oh, I'm going to vote for the candidate who's getting the endorsement from a sitting member of Congress. So that we also see some of these results in this graph as well. Now let's look at the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate has shown a similar pattern, but not similar in magnitude. So we see that between 1917 and 2017, in that 100-year period, that there has been a significant increase in the number of women who are securing Senate seats, but the big increase didn't happen until the 1990s. So we also see, as we did with the House of Representatives data, that the number of women senators has increased significantly more among Democratic senators compared with Republican senators, although as of 2017, we have seen the number of Republican senators increasing and sort of staying increased, but we see the number of Democratic senators go down a little bit, really between, say, 2017 and today. What about Black elected officials? This line graph also shows us the impact of the 15th Amendment as well as the 19th Amendment on the number of Black elected officials, because we've seen an increase in female elected officials within the Black community as well as an overall increase among Black elected officials. So it's important for us, when we're looking at any information about minorities seeking and securing public office, if we're looking at information after 1920, we're focusing on both men and women. So here we see, since the 1960s, since the Civil Rights Movement, since the March on Washington in 1963, since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, since all of those important changes of the 1960s, we have seen a significant increase in the number of Black elected officials holding office at all levels of government. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? Please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.